Hello, and welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. On this week's episode, I'm speaking to Susan Muaddi Darraj about her new novel, Behind You is the Sea. It's set in Baltimore and follows the stories of a Palestinian American immigrant community. It's a tender, sweeping novel of a family grappling with so much. Loss of identity, struggling to exist in a country that is so hostile towards them, strained family dynamics, love, difficult marriages, parent-child relationships, and so much more. Behind You is the Sea. It's the story of a Palestinian Christian community, and we know that Palestinian Christians have been facing over 76 years of occupation, and today they face erasure and genocide as the war on Gaza continues well into its 7th month. Susan Muaddi Darraj is an award-winning writer of books for adults and children. She won an American Book Award, 2 Arab American Book Awards, and a Maryland State Arts Council Independent Artist Award. In 2018, she was named a USA Artist Ford Fellow. Susan Muaddi Darraj's short story collection, A Curious Land: Stories from Home, was named the winner of the AWP Grace Paley Prize for Short Fiction. It also won a 2016 American Book Award and was shortlisted for a Palestine Book Award. Her previous short story collection, The Inheritance of Exile, was published in 2007. For children, she has written numerous YA biographies, as well as the Farah Rocks chapter book series, the first to feature an Arab American protagonist. Her new novel, Behind You is the Sea, was published in the USA in January 2024 and will be releasing in the UK in early June. I'm so glad that Susan is my guest today. Hi, Susan. Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf podcast. It's so wonderful to have you on the show today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on your show. I'm excited.
I've read your upcoming novel, Behind You is the Sea, and I just think it's such a really lovely, very gentle, tender story of a family living in the States, Palestinian family. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. I can't wait to talk to you a little bit about it today.
Thank you.
But I'm really interested in understanding your writing journey, and I guess in particular, how you feel as a Palestinian writer, given what's happening in the world today, and maybe the importance of storytelling and getting messages out, but also just to be able to talk about what life is like for Palestinians, both in Palestine, but also for the diaspora.
Yes, my writing journey began a long time ago. I was a child who was obsessed with books. I'm sure you're the same.
Yeah.
And I just could not stop reading books. Books were my friends and characters I read about, lived in my head for days and weeks afterward. I remember reading Wright in one of his books, he said he was obviously an obsessive reader and a prolific writer himself, but as a young man, he read so much that a book could actually change his mood for days. And I'm the same. So I really connected with books, and I wanted to be part of this world where you could invent a universe and invite people into that universe. My parents are immigrants to the United States. They arrived in 1967. I was born in 1975. And so my parents were very recent immigrants when I was born. And so my universe, my world at home did not look like the world in any of the books that I read. We did not have the genre of Arab American literature in the United States when I was a young person. And that's changing now, of course, but I think I perhaps wanted to write books that reflected my own universe, my own reality. And I began to do that as a college student more seriously after I graduated. And little by little, I got stories published. I had my first book as a collection of short stories, The Inheritance of Exile. It was published in 2006. And shortly after that, I published it with a small press. And shortly after that, I found an agent, a wonderful agent. He's still my agent. And everything I publish now goes through him. I'm very lucky to be writing the books that I write. I'm lucky that people want to read Palestinian American literature. And obviously, this new novel, Behind You is the Sea, I spent 6 years writing this novel. And obviously, I had no idea it would be launched during this genocide of my people. I had no clue, obviously, this was coming. Nobody did. And I have some anxiety over launching it in this time because I'm not writing a national novel. I'm not writing a nationalistic novel, I should say. I'm writing a novel about the effects of living in the diaspora as a Palestinian American. And the effects are varied and wide and devastating and also hopeful. So it's a very different book than people might expect. This is not a book that will explain the Palestinian people to anybody. This is a book that will talk about what it's like to raise your children and your grandchildren and to try to preserve your culture in a country that is hostile to that culture. That's what my novel is about.
Yeah. And I can understand that it feels so difficult and perhaps conflicting to be releasing a book in this time. As you said, that when so many of your people, so many Palestinians are unable to leave and they are suffering a genocide. Mm-hmm. And also, I guess, like, celebration right now feels bizarre as well, to celebrate something. And I'm really with you on that. I can understand that feels really strange. And I guess one of the things that I've been feeling over the last few months in particular is that so many of the other things that we're worried about, or I'm worried about, pertaining to like identity and belonging, just feel so muted.
Yes.
In the face of what's going on, which is essentially about survival, right? And it just and I think that there can feel a real disconnect. But but part of the reality is that we're still also trying to exist as diaspora communities, and it's important that we continue to find spaces and we continue to be accepted. So I think your book will touch many people and encourage people to look at things a little bit differently and understand really what's going on for so many people around the world. So before we get into Behind You is the Sea, if you could just take a moment to introduce your novel, just tell us what it's about.
The novel is about 3 families who are all immigrants to the United States. They're all Palestinians, and they live in close proximity in the city of Baltimore, Maryland, which is the city I live in now. And America has given a very different welcome to each of these families. So I do write quite a bit about class differences. I write about how some immigrants arrive in the United States and they do very well. And that's like the mythical immigrant success story that, you know, is a pervasive myth, that this idea that most immigrants come and they work hard and they do well. And it's, of course, not really true. It's actually quite rare. It's quite rare for anyone in America to do very well. Most of the country lives paycheck to paycheck. But one of the families has done well. The other 2 families are living on financial precipice. They are not people of means, and they are financially in trouble and are just the working class people who are trying to make it. And so I explore their intersecting journeys in the novel. The novel is primarily the story of a young man named Marcus Salama. He's a police officer in Baltimore. And Marcus's sister, Amal, has had a falling out with her father. He's actually banished her from the family. And so Marcus is left to navigate this relationship between his father and his sister, who don't speak to each other. And the novel is essentially their story, Marcus's attempt to understand his father. But in giving voice to Marcus's story, I gave voice to all the other characters in his community. So every chapter is handed over to a different character to tell their story. And Marcus shows up throughout the book. But the book essentially opens and closes with Marcus and his attempt to understand his father, his Palestinian immigrant father.
So the book has quite interesting form because it is a novel in that it is one story that is told through the lens of multiple characters that are all interconnected. Mm-hmm. But reading it felt much like I was reading a short story collection.
Yes.
You could basically read just a chapter in isolation and you've got a story out of it, basically, is how I feel about the book. And I know that you are also a short story writer.
I am.
And so I just wonder what led you to that form, rather than just telling a story like Marcus's story from start to finish, from his perspective, with all these other things happening as events in the story.
People meet me and initially they don't know what ethnicity I am. They take 5 or 6 guesses before they know that I'm Palestinian. But when they find out that I'm Palestinian, it's quickly apparent that I'm the only Palestinian they know. I'm the only one. And so there's this bizarre burden of representation on me as their friend. Will come to me and ask me questions like, I just heard that Netanyahu told the Turkish president X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, I am not a political representative. I don't know what you want me to tell you. Or they'll want me to explain, for example, I'm a Palestinian Christian. They'll want me to explain aspects of Islam. And I'm like, you should ask some Muslim people that question. Very strange how that burden occurs. And what I decided to do in this book is to expose the reader to myriad Palestinian voices, right? There's the immigrant, there's the great grandchild, there's the woman in college, there's the divorced woman, there's the man who's trying to reconcile with his father. There's all sorts of voices. There's working class voices, there's upper middle class voices, there are men, there are women. So I wanted to expose the reader to several different voices to help them understand the community. Because I did not feel like, like Marcus's problem with his father stems from the fact that there are very different burdens placed on the immigrant than are placed on the children of immigrants. And so I didn't think Marcus could actually explain all of that. There are immigrants in the book. His own father, his aunt's husband, for example, has a chapter, Mr. Ammar. When I started to write those viewpoints through Marcus's perspective, Marcus sounded very condescending. And I do not ever want to talk down to that experience. Immigrants, especially from Palestine, are people who left behind a homeland that they didn't know would ever survive the wars, the Israeli occupation. They were leaving a country behind. They didn't want to leave. They wanted to stay, but they couldn't stay. And so they are a generation that is eternally grieving their loss. And I did not want Marcus to make light of that or talk down to that. So I decided to hand over those chapters to those characters in order to preserve my sense as the author, to preserve my respect for what they have been through. Yeah. And the same with the great grandchildren. There's the story of Hiba, the college student who's really going through a lot of body imagery issues, and she's really suffering. And I did not want someone else I didn't want another character who would give a skewed version of what she was suffering, right? To make light of what she's suffering. So I just handed the chapter over to her. And I do love to write short stories. And so I have a playful side. I like exploring with different voices. And so it was a challenge for me to make each of these voices authentic.
That makes complete sense. And because you fully hand the chapter over to the different characters. And I love multi-point of view stories. I just find them so enriching and really fascinating because it's interesting as a reader to see things from different perspectives, because something is always amiss and there's always hidden secrets and always things, and it just adds so much depth. But the one thing I will say is that there's a lot of characters.
Yes,
there's a lot of point of views, and I think the thing is that we don't sit with any one character for very long. Had that chapter and they might dip in and out between the other chapters, but we don't spend too much time with them. But still, I think it's a really interesting form, and I really did enjoy it. And I enjoyed, I think, the diversity of the different issues you were able to talk about and the stories and experiences you were able to present, which I guess with a more of a linear form, maybe you can't experiment so much, and that's not so possible.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that you are a Christian, you are a Palestinian Christian,
Mm-hmm.
and as are, I think, pretty much all of your characters in the book. Now, I'm really interested in understanding a little bit about your experience as being a Palestinian Christian. And I say that because I know that I think it's about 25% of Palestinians are Christian.
Yes.
But I think the overarching assumption that like the news will have you believe is that everybody is Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we see is very Islamophobic language being used about what's happening, or about Hamas, or about Palestine, very Islamophobic and racist language and tropes being used to talk about the Palestinian resistance movement. But the Palestinian community the Christian community in Palestine is the oldest in the world. And in the current genocide have been absolutely just completely, I don't know what the right word to use is, but
Erased.
it is awful. Erased. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say, I can't remember what I was going to say, but yeah, completely erased. And also I think forgotten. Yes. Because so much of the narrative is that this is a Muslim situation or a Muslim issue, and forgotten by like mainstream news, but I would say also by the worldwide Christian movement and the church. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if you could just reflect a little bit on representation of Palestinian Christians and your experience, especially in light of what's going on at the moment.
Sure. Yes, we are the oldest Christian community in the world. And everyone else in the world is Christian because our ancestors nurtured this very young religion during the Roman Empire and practiced their faith secretly in caves and underground so that they wouldn't be arrested until the Emperor Constantine and his mother decided to convert. And then all of a sudden, Christianity was the religion of the empire, and the rest is history. The Palestinian Christian community has been our voices have been consistently erased from the discussions of Israel and Palestine, precisely because it's very important for the West and for the occupying Israeli forces to have a villain, right? And the villain is Islam. And the facts are that the Christian community in Palestine has lived peacefully side by side with the Muslim Palestinian community for centuries. This is a very beautiful example of inclusivity and diversity. And the world should actually model itself after that relationship that we have. Yeah. I myself grew up in a Palestinian immigrant community in Philadelphia, and we had Muslim friends, many Muslim friends, and we would celebrate Eid with them, and they would celebrate Christmas and Easter with us. And I'm very familiar with Muslim traditions, and I understand the culture and the traditions, and this is very normal for us. If you go to Palestine during Ramadan, you will not find Christians eating out in the open in cafes. They will maintain the fast in public so that they will respect their Muslim neighbors and friends, right? This is a very wonderful example of peacefully living side by side. And that the existence of our community is very much a threat to that narrative which is necessary to maintain the occupation, right? And I ask people all the time, there was much made of St. Porphyrius Church and other churches in Gaza. And I said to people, if there is such a crackdown on people in Gaza by Hamas, and I'm not defending Hamas here in any way. I'm simply saying there is like this default narrative that Hamas is so bad and they control everybody. They control literally everybody in Gaza. You hear these things about they're making people use their children as human shields. This is some of the most racist stuff I've ever heard in my life. But I've said to people, how can these Christian communities, how can these churches still be operating and still be standing? If what you believe is true, how can these Christians practice in the open, practice their faith? They just held Palm Sunday and Easter services during a genocide. Their churches are being used as bomb shelters for Muslims and Christians alike. So how can this narrative hold up about the villainous Muslim? How can this narrative hold up? If you, the minute you introduce the Palestinian Christian experience, that narrative falls apart. And then the whole thing falls apart. And so those are my thoughts. I find it very offensive, especially when Western evangelical Christians jump on the bandwagon, so to speak, and talk about the situation, because they literally do not know what they're talking about. If they knew what they were talking about, they would come to the defense of the Christian population, which is also under occupation and which has also been displaced and which has also been suffering for 76 years now. So yeah, I find the Western take on the Palestinian Christian population to be completely misguided.
And I think as well, I think I've heard you talk about this before, that even like Palestinian Christians, even in the West, are also subject to Islamophobia because of this idea that, or this sort of like this myth or this narrative that the Palestinian is Muslim and that is how this enemy is created. And we even see it in the book. There's assumptions by other people that our family is Muslim, that our family does not drink alcohol or eat pork because they're Palestinian and therefore must be Muslim, which is very just very silly, very ignorant.
It's incredibly silly. It's laughable. It's laughable, and that's why I make fun of those characters, because I find them to be utterly ridiculous.
Yeah,
I had a woman once say to me, I put this on Twitter once and it went viral. I had a woman say to me, a version of a conversation I've had a million times, and she said, "You're Christian? You're a Palestinian Christian?" I said, "Yes." And she said, "How is that possible? Did you convert?" And I said, "No, you did." So, and because the ignorance is so shocking and so laughable. And one of the other stereotypes, and I thank God every day that we have journalists in Gaza, like Bisan, like Hind Khudairi, like Salah Jafawari. So I thank God for them every day. I check on them every single day throughout the day, because their videos are really important. They are documenting what's happening. And one of the pervasive stereotypes of the Islamic community, of course, is its oppression of women, as if Islam somehow invented misogyny and invented patriarchy. Patriarchy is everywhere. I certainly talk about it in my book. But I've said to people, look at the videos that you're seeing. Look at the doctors and the nurses. They're women. Look at the people that you're describing in such a monolithic way. The videos themselves shatter the stereotypes that you are regurgitating here. So I'm very happy that we live in an era of social media where we can receive this information in such an unfiltered way, because it really helps us when we're talking to people here about some of these issues.
Yes,
sorry,
exactly.
I went off topic a little bit. I apologize.
Yeah, and also, if we look at the content, not just what they're showing right now, but Bisan is very good at showing her life before October, showing she was at university and she was traveling and she was doing this and she was doing that, and she does not wear hijab, and she is not forced to wear hijab. If she wants to wear it, she can wear it, but she's deciding not to. And I just think that it's so powerful. Like, people are telling their stories, but there is still so much. People are holding on to a narrative that serves them for whatever reason. And I think that, like, across the board, like, generally there has to be a bad person or a bad side that is vilified so badly, even if it is completely wrong, in order to try and justify what is happening. But the fact is that, as you said, we live in an age where the evidence is apparent. Things are coming out all of the time that show actually this narrative is wrong. And I think we are seeing things change, and there is definitely the tide is changing, but it's just, it still really shocks me.
It reminds me of that famous study that they did a long time ago that allegedly showed that if you expose a baby to like classical music like Mozart, it will make them smarter and more successful later in their lives. That study has been debunked like several times, apparently. It was just a fluke. But people still hold on to that. They still say over and over, oh, There's no baby shower I've attended where the mother to be wasn't gifted like a Mozart CD set or something. Because it just, in their point of view, it somehow fits and it somehow makes sense. And so they just hold on to it despite the evidence to the contrary. So here, the same thing. You know, I think, though, that we just have to be persistent and insist on facts and insist on showing. And I'm not trying to romanticize the Palestinian community by any means. I'm sure you know that now that you've read my book.
Yeah.
I'm not romanticizing anybody in this book. I'm simply trying to complicate a very black and white binary that exists. Yeah, because I think the minute you make something more nuanced, that's the best way to approach it. Like, nothing is ever simple. Nothing is ever good or bad, black and white.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the really, I think, very heartbreaking and tender things that you explore in the book is the relationship between father and son. And we see it a couple of times with a few of the characters in the book. And I really enjoyed reading it. And I found it actually really somber because we see people of two different generations, one of whom is an immigrant, having had to leave everything behind in Palestine, unable to go back and experiencing just this heart-wrenching loss. And then you've got their child who is trying to grow up and find a balance between the two worlds. But then we also have this inability to talk about emotion and talk about history and what's happened. What were some of the things that you were really interested in exploring with this father and son, this strained relationship and the intergenerational trauma? But also, actually, before you said that, I want to say I really the fact that you wrote so many male characters, because we never criticize or we never ask men about writing female characters. I like the fact that we were having so much so many male characters written by a woman. But anyway, please, if you could just talk about that father-son and intergenerational trauma element.
Sure. I have there's a lot of focus on the relationships of mothers and daughters, mothers and fathers and sons. But surely my primary focus was, as I said earlier, Marcus and his father, and that's who you're referring to. And so Marcus's father, the man who had to leave Palestine and did not want to leave Palestine and regrets that he left. He regrets it. And I think that as a daughter of immigrants myself, I think even I grew up not really understanding how much my parents lost. I know. And the thing about Palestinian immigrants is that many of them, and I think many people who come from countries where there's destruction, they're always hoping to go back, but there's always a reckoning point. There's always a moment where you realize, I will not be going back. I cannot go back. And so then they realize something else that's even more scary for them, which is that they have to raise their children in a country that they themselves are just beginning to understand. And as Palestinians, because you know that your country is under threat of erasure, the land of Palestine has been shrinking and shrinking every decade, year. It gets smaller and smaller. You can look at the maps and see how much land has been confiscated. And earlier we were talking about this insistence on, like, the West insisting that the villain here is Islam. And that's because it's convenient to frame this as some kind of a cultural or religious war. This is not a cultural or religious war. This is an issue of occupation and land theft. That's what this is about. So I think that, and it's kind of hard. It was hard for me to explore the immigrant's point of view, because at some point they love their children. They will do anything for their children. But at some point, even they feel, I believe, that their children have betrayed them, right? They feel that their children don't really appreciate everything they've done for them. And I don't blame them for feeling that way. I really don't. Now, with Marcus, his father, Marcus, at the end of the book, has to go back to Palestine. The reader will find out why he goes back to Palestine. But he has to go to Palestine. And actually, I'm saying he's going back to Palestine. It's actually his first time going to Palestine. And he goes to his father's village. And he has to be there in order to see what his father has lost. That's the only way he's going to understand his father, is if he understands what his father has lost. And at the same time, of course, there is Marcus's point of view, which is the children of immigrants did not ask to be born between two homelands, right? They were simply born, and they're trying to make their way in this world that their parents don't understand. So they don't have parents to guide them through this new world that they live in. They have to make their own way. Marcus is simply trying to do that. And of course, America is always, immigrants come here thinking the streets are paved in gold. And of course, America is a country with its own very complicated racist history that it has not yet confronted. We have now in 2024 organizations of people trying to ban books that talk honestly about the era of slavery and the era of segregation. These books, there's a very strenuous attempt to ban these books because people do not want to talk about our history. Be a Palestinian in this country, challenge in itself, because you're an ethnic minority. Many times you're a religious minority. And so you are facing a lot of the struggles that other racial and ethnic minorities in this country have faced. And that's a challenge in and of itself. So yeah, those are just some loose thoughts about your question. I'm not sure if I answered your question fully or not.
I think what you said were just some very poignant and like beautiful reflections, I think, on what our characters go through, but on what so many children of immigrants, and I think especially refugees,
yes,
because I think there is such a diversity and a range of experiences. It's very difficult to capture it, but I think so much will resonate with so many different groups around the world. Yeah. You talked earlier about the burden of representation that's on you, how people will ask you ridiculous questions about politics or about Islam and you're not even Muslim. But as a Palestinian Christian who's written a book about Palestinian Christians, how did you navigate the burden of representation that comes with that? Because as you said, you haven't romanticized the experience of Palestinians. Your characters, all of them are very flawed, which I love to read because we are all flawed. Like, they're all flawed. There's some very dark things that happen, some very dark emotions that people experience. There's even a scene where a nephew punches his uncle in the stomach. There's all kinds of stuff, but there's some also very, very heavy things that happen. How did you navigate the burden of representation that was on you to not put an already persecuted community under even more fire? That's
a hard thing because white people write novels about white people who do bad things.
Absolutely.
And nobody thinks that they're representing white people. But because the publishing industry in North America and Europe doesn't really publish voices or doesn't really offer platforms to like Palestinian American voices, for example, the few books that come out every year, there's like this burden on us. Jacqueline Woodson, one of my favorite authors, said one time that, and I'm paraphrasing her very badly here, but she basically said, my loyalty is like to my reader, and I just have to tell the reader what my version of the truth is. And so some of the early reviews of this book, like a lot of Arab reviewers did not like this book, and many of them did, right? But the worst thing you can do as a writer is read your Goodreads reviews. It's like the worst. Yes. It's like the worst thing you can do for yourself. There was one reviewer in particular, I guess she was a young Palestinian woman, and she just thought the book was full of stereotypes and very poor representation of Palestinian men, especially. And I thought to myself, yeah, there are a couple of really bad men in my book. Sure. There are a couple of really bad women in my book, of course. Samira's mother is, in my opinion, one of the worst people in the world. And Dahlia, the diva housewife, is a really terrible character as well. But I feel like there are also many very wonderful men and wonderful women in the book. And I'm not trying to write I'm not trying to I'm just trying to depict people in their full humanity. And even very good people make mistakes. And sometimes very bad people have moments of insight and connection. And that's what I'm trying to do. So I feel like as a writer, I have to insist on my freedom to write the characters as they come into my mind and as they take shape in my mind. And I'm sure people who don't write are sick of hearing this, but the characters really do take over a book. They really do. Like Marcus lived in my head for months before I wrote him down. And initially I was writing Marcus from his sister's point of view. And then I said, you know what, let me just try to write him with his own voice. And I really enjoyed that process. I'm glad you liked all the male characters in the book, because once I wrote Marcus, I felt like I can do this. I can write a male character and I can write it authentically. So I have just allowed the characters to take over the book. And it would be a very boring book if they all behaved perfectly well, if they all did the right thing. But that would not make for a very exciting book.
Yeah. I think this issue, this burden of representation in the way that we've just spoken about it, is incredibly unfair. And it is a product of the society that we live in, of the racist policies and politics around the world. And I feel it in my everyday life on a massive level. If I'm walking down the street and I don't know, if I swear out loud or something, right, I will feel that, oh my gosh, if someone sees me, they're going to be like, oh, look how vulgar these Muslims are.
It's terrible. I know. I know.
And I think but that's a very heavy burden to carry. And I think so many of us have been carrying it for so long. And the Palestinian poet, activist, Muhammad al-Kurd, in his poetry collection, Rifka, he writes about it doesn't matter if we're good. And sometimes Palestinian people like we're awful, but we still deserve to live. We still deserve mercy and compassion. And I just think that's such an important thing to remember, that even if there are bad people, it does not mean that they are deserving of genocide. But I guess that's the situation that we find ourselves in, is that we're trying to justify why we should be spared, or why we should be saved, or why refugees should be allowed to come and live in our country. Why you're trying to be like, but it's because we're good, give us a chance, we're good. And it's just such I think a really sorry state. That's what the situation has been reduced down to, us trying to justify our existence.
I agree with everything you just said. And I'm very deeply offended that in Palestine right now, parents have to share their final goodbyes with their children. They have to share that moment with a camera. I hate that. I hate that has to be the case, that they have to share. There was like this myth told about the 40 beheaded babies, and those mythical babies got more sympathy than the children in Gaza, whose bodies are being blown apart every single day. The other day I saw a video of a fetus that had been taken from a dead fetus that had been taken from its mother's body. I've never seen such shocking things. Yeah. And that these moments have to be shared with a camera so that Palestinians can say, look at us, look at what we're going through. It's really a horrible kind of situation, but it's all the consequence of racism. Yeah. And to add to your earlier point, if I may, this burden of representation is more challenging, I believe, as a woman, because if I write something critical of patriarchy in Arab society, which we have patriarchy like every society does.
Yeah.
This is seen as somehow confirmation of that villainous Arab man that we've been talking about. This is seen as someone on the inside confirming the stereotype of the terrible misogynistic Arab man. Like I have a story in the book titled The Hashtag. It's one of the chapters. It's Ranya's chapter. And see, even I'm calling them stories. But Ranya's chapter, there's an incident that's recounted in the book that Westerners would refer to as an honor killing. It's a form of domestic violence. And in the story, in the chapter, it's the people in the community, the men and the women, who insist on justice for this victim. It's not some Western reporter who comes in and gets wind of the story. No, it's the people in her own community who insist that the body be exhumed and that there be an investigation done and so on and so forth. So I'm trying to show how, even patriarchy, violence, misogyny, these things are challenged in the Palestinian community, just like they're challenged in every community. Just my inclusion of such violence in a chapter doesn't mean that I'm outing my people, right? It means I'm trying to do something much more complex and nuanced than that. So I just wanted to add that.
Absolutely. And I think in order to, because it's not just about, if you expose an issue, you can help to challenge it. You're exposing the issue, but also exposing the fact that it's already being challenged. Like, we don't need to expose the issue so that we can have an army of white people come to save and come to help those people. The fact is that, and I think this applies around the world, like, people are already trying to deal with the issue themselves because they know that this is not okay. Even if we think about the practice of FGM, the change in that is coming from communities within themselves. Actually, there's lots of good work happening to assist it and to help it. But the biggest change is when people themselves stand up and say, no, we are not going to do this. And that is happening, I think, on a scale that we don't really know about. And that's just one example of how these things are already happening. But again, because of these racist stereotypes, the West are constantly looking for ways to be able to say, look, we're here to save you. We will be your savior.
And they're obsessed with what we wear. So if you wear hijab, they are obsessed with hijab. They are obsessed with the hijab and what it means and why is she wearing it and what, France banned it. And like, it's lunacy to be like this. Like, here are Muslim and Arab women telling you, here are the issues around which we would like to organize. Here are the issues that are important to us. And they're more interested in talking about our clothing choices. I've said to people, my Christian grandmother wore a veil like this. If you look at depictions of the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus, she's wearing a very similar head covering. This is a garment that has lots of different meanings. You cannot reduce it to one thing. And you're reducing it to something without listening to the women who are wearing it. You're condemning it, you're banning it, you're assuming lots of things about it without having open conversations with the women who are choosing to wear it. So it's upset. It's very strange.
Yeah, they're not interested in having their own stereotypes and narratives challenged. It's whatever will feed into existing stereotypes. And Etaf Room, she writes about this idea of literary empathy, about how when you come to a piece of work, you have to come by putting your prejudices aside. You have to come open-minded and open-hearted. If you come already with prejudice in mind, you will take the smallest thing and you will allow it to feed your already existing stereotypes. And if it doesn't do that, you'll just ignore it. But you will allow it to feed what you already think, rather than giving yourself the time and the space to open up and really think about what you can learn from this piece of work.
Absolutely. She's quite right about that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. She's been through a lot over the last few months as well. I would like to ask you, what is behind the title of your book, Behind You is the Sea? Because it's a very interesting title. What led you to give the novel this name? Where did it come from?
It's from the very famous story of the Muslim conquest of southern Spain. Tariq ibn Ziyad, the famous general who led the conquest of southern Spain. And I feel like every Arab father recites this story. And essentially the story is that when he landed on the coast of Spain with his troops, they had crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, and Gibraltar is named after him. It's Jebel Tariq. It became Gibraltar. They landed on the coast of Spain, and his soldiers must have balked at the invasion. And so he spurred them on by doing something very dramatic, which is he burned all the ships on the harbor behind them. And he told them, behind you is the sea, before you is the enemy. So essentially he was telling them, you have no choice but to go forward and survive and win. And I feel like that's the experience. A lot of immigrants who come to the United States are very grieving what they've lost, and they cannot go back. Growing up in the United States was a real challenge because Palestine was never on a map. Like it felt like something that existed in our hearts and in our minds, at least when you're talking to Westerners about it. But I feel like the experience of many immigrants is like that. It's this idea that they have no choice but to make it here in this new land where they've arrived. So America has given them a home. It's maybe not given them the warmest welcome, but it's given them somewhere to start, and they have to make it here. No matter what they end up losing, their children may not end up speaking their language. Their children may end up not emulating their traditions. Their children may never go back to Palestine themselves. But they have to try to survive here and raise their families here and cultivate a love of family, of tradition, of Palestine here in this new world with which they're very unfamiliar. But they don't have a choice. And so that's where that title comes from.
Yeah, really very beautiful. So in writing the book, do you have a favorite character or a favorite mini? I mean, we've been calling them stories, but a favorite chapter, because essentially each chapter is dedicated to a character. Is there one that is your favorite, or was your favorite to write?
I really the chapter, Samira's chapter, the tough lawyer. I originally wrote Samira as a secondary character in Ranya's chapter, the hashtag. I came up with this idea of this tough as nails Palestinian American woman. She's a lawyer and she doesn't give anybody any slack. She's very good at her job, but she's very brusque and very businesslike. And I thought to myself, she just stayed in my head for a long time. And I wanted to investigate her a bit. And so I started sketching her out and giving her a backstory. And I saw this meme on social media, I don't know, years ago, and I'm sure you've seen a version of it, but it basically says, when you meet somebody who's tough and resilient, many times it's because life didn't give them another choice. That was Samira. I gave her this really difficult kind of backstory with her family and her marriage and her life. Yeah, so I really enjoyed writing about her quite a bit. Yeah, she was fun for me to get to know.
She is an absolutely wonderful character. And what do you really hope for anyone that picks up your book?
Honestly, I hope that people pick up this book wanting to learn about this community they know nothing about, and I hope they feel that this community feels very familiar to them. I hope they read about these characters and feel connected to them, or they feel like they know these people. Wouldn't it be wonderful if people could recognize their own family members or even part of themselves in some of these characters that they imagined would be foreign and different? That would be a wonderful thing.
Yeah, I hope. And I think people will do that. You said that this book took you 6 years to write. By the time you got to the end of the 6 years, how did you feel about some of the stuff that you'd written early on? Or were you just changing things as you went along? Like, what was that like?
Yes, I teach full time and I have 3 children. And so my life is very busy. So writing is something I have to slip into the cracks of my day. That's why it took so long. But there's something beneficial to that. That slow process allows me to constantly reconsider what I've written. For example, Mr. Ammar's chapter, I originally wrote that from Marcus's point of view. And like a month later, I went back to it, ready to write the next chapter. And I said, now that I've thought about it for a little bit, this doesn't feel right. Let me try to do it from Mr. Ammar's point of view. Let me see if I can make a thoroughly unlikable character. Let me see if I can make him at least a little bit understandable to the reader. Because he just seemed like a buffoon from Marcus's point of view. And I didn't want that. So there is something to that slow process. it allows me to reconsider, to reflect as I'm going through. So yes, I was constantly revising as I went through. Absolutely.
Susan, it has been so wonderful speaking to you today. And Behind You is the Sea is already out in the States, but it's out in early June in the UK. So I'm really excited for more people to get their hands on it and to read it and to just become lost in the world and the characters that you've created. Thank you so much for all that you do and for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.
If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and subscribe to the Diverse Bookshelf podcast on your podcast platform of choice and come and connect with me on social media. I'd love to hear from you. It would also really help if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show.